Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is my colleague, Assistant Managing Editor Diane Brady. Diane, thanks for coming on.
Always a pleasure, Brittany, with you.
This is so exciting, and you are joining us from APEC in San Francisco. What's the mood like there? Let's start off with that.
Well, it's interesting because my first APEC was actually 12 years ago, which was when the US last hosted, which was in Honolulu. All the conversation back then was about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a pivot to Asia. That's when Obama was in the administration. So it feels in some ways like a return to that because the message very much from President Biden has been that we, partly with this sort of reestablishment of relations with China to some extent, this idea that the US is a stable force in the world, so is China. We must engage with the region. So there are some similarities in coming full circle, but to be honest, I think one of the differences is it feels like kind of a California tech conference instead of a global conference, which is 21 economies coming together and really that intersection of business and policymakers. So I think there's certainly some disappointment from the international attendees.
Is the United States out of touch then, based on that approach?
It's a good question. I mean, a lot of it is because we're heading into election season. I'd say Joe Biden's speech, a lot of it was certainly directed at a domestic audience, which you could say sometimes is always the case, but when you're getting into details like the UAW and strikes, that's not really resonating with a global audience. So, yes, to some extent, I suppose there's a certain irresistible component. You're in San Francisco, so you can get the head of Google, you can get the head of Salesforce, but I think it's, yeah, maybe partly that we're out of touch. I think there's a certain assumption that we're showcasing the best of the US. And I think one of the missed opportunities here has been a chance to really highlight some of the entrepreneurs, the founders, and the big companies from the 20 other economies, some of which are huge, of course, China, right? Mexico, Canada. There's just not as much global representation on stage as I would have expected.
Something you said that struck me is you can get the head of Google, you can get the head of Salesforce. They got the head of X and until they didn't. So Elon Musk was supposed to be there. Now he's not
I
speaking on
know.
stage. Can you talk about that and what has been the reaction to that?
Well, great disappointment, of course, because there were a lot of people who were really looking forward to a Mark Benioff interviews Elon Musk. The talk is that he dropped out. I think he may well have been slightly pushed out because of these. Essentially, what happened was there was an anti-Semitic tweet. I still call them an X, is that we're supposed to call them, and Musk responded, "I agree." So what I would have preferred, of course, would have been if Benioff had put him on stage and asked him about that, because that would have been interesting to get his reaction. But no, it's disappointment. Now Benioff is interviewing John Kerry, who's already spoken here, and it's not quite the same. So that's disappointing. I think there's disappointment because Xi Jinping, typically the leaders of the biggest economies, give a speech. He did not give a speech here. A lot of the Chinese companies are very upset about that, of course, because that's a big deal. But I think there's also excitement that there's this meeting with Biden and Xi, and this sense that at least they're talking, at least in a world that's going crazy, with what's happening in Israel, what's happening in the Ukraine, that at a time when so much is unpredictable, that the US and China are talking again. And I think that passes for good news in this environment.
I do want to talk about China in just a moment, but first, can we focus on President Biden's speech? He recently made remarks. Can you discuss and dive a little deeper into the substance of his conversation?
Yeah, I think that certainly part of what he was talking about is what his administration has accomplished, and that's very much for the hometown crowd. I think there was an acknowledgement of the importance of the Asia Pacific region to the US and the US to that region. But I think the substance and the most important part of his comments were with regard to China and the idea that to communicate again on a military basis so that there's no miscommunication in times of trouble. That's very positive. The idea that there will be more communication around trade, AI, important issues like drugs, of course, because fentanyl's been a huge issue here in the US. So that's very positive. And then he made it very clear that to be careful when it came to talking about things like human rights, IP protections, a lot of the things that have been a great concern to business. And also an understanding that a lot of these economies, huge economies like Indonesia, are going to forge their own relationship with China and their own relationship with the US. So I think he was taking a very measured approach, very positive. I can tell you, I asked a few people on the way out who I've met here who are from places like China, and one of the things they're very cognizant of is that we're going into an election year, and the last time President Trump was here, he basically came to APEC, said, America first, we like bilateral relations, and goodbye. So they're very aware there could be another president waiting in the wings who has a very different view of all this.
I have the opportunity to talk to politicians on really a weekly basis, and they continuously say our biggest geopolitical
basis, Brittany.
A daily basis,
all
essentially. But they all have the same message. China is our biggest geopolitical threat. And as you and I know, as the rest of the country knows, President Biden has called President Xi a dictator straight up. A, do you think his messaging on China has changed? And B, do you think it's tough enough for the American people?
It's an interesting question because he was asked that yesterday after this meeting, and he basically came out and said, yes, I do believe Xi is a dictator. He has a very different system. It's not a democratic system as we know it here in the US. So I don't think his stance on that has changed. And of course, China has been a very popular punching bag, and sometimes legitimately so, certainly when it comes to IP protections and rule of law and the treatment of the Uyghurs and various other things. But I think especially at a time when you've got all of these renegade regimes in Russia, when you look at what's happening in the Middle East, at a time when the world feels so dangerous, it's important for the two largest economies of the world to be talking to each other. And I think that's the message. It wasn't an enthusiastic embrace so much as it was an acknowledgement of the importance of some stability right now.
Let's talk about that a little more. Did this move the needle in one way or another when it comes to U.S.-China relations? Because multiple politicians have told me we're essentially in a Cold War with China. Did this seem to thaw those tensions at all?
I think so. I mean, certainly there's been a lot of business already taking place. So when you look at what's happening with U.S. companies, yes, we diversify our supply chains, but a lot of U.S. companies still have their supply chains in China. I think there's certainly a sense that President Xi is much in a different state today than he was a couple of years ago because his economy is very much struggling, and he's in not as strong a position because China post-COVID is not in a good place on several levels. So I think that that's one of the factors here, that they've also warmed to us perhaps and are taking a kinder stance. But look, I think that we in a Cold War with China. I think what happens is the rest of the world, when it goes a little crazy, you start to shift your attention a bit and you start to look at Russia, you start to look at North Korea, you start to look at what's happening in the Middle East and where you want friends. And for all of the problems we have with China, it's not really a renegade actor. China is not a rogue actor. They want stability. They want to develop the ASEAN region. They want to be a powerhouse. So that makes them a powerhouse we compete against. But I think at the end of the day, I think there's more of an acknowledgement and more of a warmth in trying to be the grown-ups in the room, if that's one way to put it.
And I mean, as you noted, Americans have been angry with China based on a host of different issues, everything from TikTok, spy balloon, everything in between over the past year. So how has President Xi been received? You're our eyes on the ground. What can you tell us?
I'm the eyes on the ground here in a conference of business leaders And so let me just acknowledge, first of all, this is a bit of a protected bubble, this Moscone Center, wherever it is. You walk outside and there's a lot of protesters, the majority of which are, pro-Palestine from what I've seen, but there are some that are also protesting China. That would, had the U.S., had the situation with the Israel-Hamas war not taken place, there still would have been protesters, and probably there would have been more about China and some of the issues we've had there with human rights. So I think the mood with regard to Xi inside here is relatively positive because people want to engage with a stable China, and we want to exploit the opportunities in this region for more connections. That said, globalization's become a dirty word in general, and there's much more of a sense of what's happening on the ground. One of the biggest themes here is sustainability, and we've come through an incredible year of, climate trauma, I would say. That is a collective global problem, and China may be the world's biggest polluter, but it's also the world's biggest producer of a lot of the green clean tech, and they also have a lot of the stuff we need to create our own clean tech here in the US and electric vehicles. So I think on that level, there's an understanding that there are bigger problems, and it's good for the US and China to work together on those problems.
There's obviously a lot of sound bites, a lot of news coming out of APEC, but from you being there firsthand, do you think anything's really missing from the national conversation that we're not able to see over on the East Coast?
That's a good point, because I think, first of all, while this is look, I like APEC because of the access you get to policymakers. It's very unusual to have policymakers and public-private sector together on the same stage. That said, I think there is a missed opportunity here. East Coast, West Coast, whatever. It's a very US-centric conference, and I think the value of a place like this is also to listen and learn. And I wish there were more opportunities to listen and learn from the other players here, whether they're entrepreneurs, policymakers, big companies, small companies. I think that's the biggest missed opportunity because that is what APEC is about. Otherwise, it's just another tech conference where people can go in and out and they don't stick around. And I think there's a little bit of the buzz missing for that reason. At least when I talk to the attendees, especially from other countries, they're a little disappointed.
Diane, you're a big listener, a big learner. What have you learned the most being there?
It's a good question. What have I learned? Well, look, I love talking to the various folks. I think there is, I'm certainly interested in Indonesia. I think that that's a country to keep our eyes on. I think there's a lot of interest in what's happening there in the entrepreneurship. I've had a lot of interesting conversations with people from Cambodia, Vietnam, what's happening there. So I think the entrepreneurial energy and how they're using AI is very interesting. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to Chinese companies because we get so focused on the politics that you forget about the innovation that goes on in the ground. So some of the incredible things they're doing with AI and what some of the things that are happening in the clean tech space, very interesting. And I suppose the other thing that I've found quite interesting is a lot of investors, it's hard to raise capital in the US right now. So there's a lot of focus on trying to raise money from wealthy families in Asia. And as we know in Asia, a lot of the biggest companies are also synonymous with the billionaires and the wealthiest people. So there's, I'm sensing more of a pivot toward Asia in terms of trying to get the capital that you used to raise in the US to do the things here.
Diane, I'm going to steal one of your famous questions and ask you, is there anything on your radar right now that you want to put on ours?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, I was watching Sean Hannity last night and talking to people on the streets, and I think going into an election year and the rhetoric that we're hearing out of the Republican Party and whether there's an acknowledgement or, obviously I'm not partisan either way. I think that Biden was playing to his base, as will Trump and Haley and everybody else. I think that this will be used as something to show that Biden is soft on China. I think that'll be the message on one side of the house. I think with everything else that's going on in the world, I'll be very interested to see to what extent do we embrace the role the U.S. has to play right now with the geopolitical landscape, because that's top of mind for all these business leaders. These are global companies. They operate in a global landscape. And when Europe and the Middle East are so unpredictable, Asia's where the growth is, making enemies is not good for our bottom line. So I'm very interested to just see how this plays out on both sides of the political spectrum.
Diane, enjoy the rest of your time at APEC. Thank you so much for coming on and telling our viewers, giving us a taste of what's happening there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brittany. See you back in the office.